Now I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Ken Thompson. Ken is a retired academic and he's published 170 scientific papers and several books on gardening and popular science. The Skeptical Gardener, a collection of his gardening columns from the Daily Telegraph, was published by Icon Books in 2015, and a second collection was published in 2020. In 2016, he was awarded the Royal Horticultural Society's Veitch Memorial Medal for his contribution to the advancement and improvement of the science and practice of horticulture. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and I'm going to hand you over to Ken.
Thank you. So, I'm sharing my screen.
Yeah, we haven't got your slides now. We've got, I think, just your general what's going on your computer. So it hasn't come onto your slideshow.
Really? Well,
It looks like you're sharing your web browser at the moment. So if you stop that and try again.
And try again. There you go. Something always goes wrong, doesn't it? Right.
Yeah, that's great.
There we go.
Yeah, perfect.
So the official title is Gardening for Wildlife, the Sheffield BUGS project, but and the Sheffield BUGS project is going to get a fair amount of airtime during this talk, but I'm going to spread my net a bit wider than that and talk about not just the Sheffield BUGS project, but the general work on the general research work on wildlife gardening that's taken place over the last few decades, really, because there's been quite a lot. But first of all, some context, because until about 50 years ago, no one would have given a talk on gardening for wildlife or on wildlife in gardens, because there was a general perception that there really wasn't much wildlife in gardens at all. The general feeling was, among the general public, among academics, among ecologists, among gardeners, was that gardens were just too managed, too artificial, too alien to be any use for wildlife. And therefore, we all owe an enormous debt of gratitude to my personal wildlife gardening hero, which is Jennifer Owen here. And here she is pictured with her Veitch Memorial Medal from the Royal Horticultural Society, which she was awarded about 10 years ago. And what Jennifer Owen did was she decided to find out if there actually was any wildlife in gardens by catching and counting as much of the wildlife as she could in her very ordinary Leicester garden. And she started doing that in 1972. And then she carried on. Once she started, she found she couldn't stop. And after she'd been doing it for 15 years, she wrote this book, The Ecology of a Garden, the first 15 years. And then she carried on for another 15 years. And she wrote another book, Wildlife of a Garden, which was published by the Society, which includes the whole 30-year story. And Jennifer Owen was really the first person in Britain and one of the first people in the world to appreciate that there actually was wildlife in gardens, lots of wildlife in gardens, and that it was actually worth studying. over the whole 30-year period, Jennifer Owen found 54 species of birds in her garden, 7 species of mammals, 3 species of amphibians, 1,997 species of insects, and 138 species of other miscellaneous invertebrates, spiders, millipedes, woodlice, slugs, whatever. So that's a pretty large total, really. But the detail is more interesting than that. The first thing we can say from these numbers is that there are an awful lot more of these small creatures down here than there are of these bigger ones. An awful lot more species. And of course, in terms of numbers of individuals, the difference is even larger. The other thing we can say is that these numbers up here, birds, mammals, amphibians, are reasonably complete. If she kept going for another 30 years, it's unlikely that Jennifer Owen would have added many species to this list. Possibly no more species to the mammals and amphibians, maybe 1 or 2 more birds. These lists, however, and especially this one, the insects, are very far from complete. We know they're very far from complete because there are so many insects in a typical garden that Jennifer Owen, despite being an accomplished naturalist in her own right and despite having a lot of help from other people, simply wasn't able to identify most of the insects that she caught in her garden. If you make some reasonable assumptions about her, about all the insects that she simply wasn't able to identify, there may, over that 30-year period, have been anything up to about 10,000 species of insects in her garden. So that's the second thing we can gain from these numbers. And the third one, which is perhaps the most important, is that these species down here, the small species, most of which the average gardener will never notice, despite them being present in sometimes very large numbers, are arguably the most important. Because even if you only like watching these larger animals, what you have to remember is most of these large animals here eat these smaller animals, prey on them. And therefore, if you want to have a healthy population of birds, mammals, amphibians, maybe even reptiles as well, you have to have a healthy population of these smaller animals. And if you have a lot of these smaller animals, you will have plenty of these larger animals as well. So let me just give you an example of the kinds of things Jennifer Owen found in her garden. At least 533 species of parasitoid wasps. I say at least because actually she only caught and identified them for 3 years out of the 30 years. And had she carried on for longer, she would certainly have found more. And these are most amazing creatures. This one pictured here is a big one, but mostly they're very small, which is why they tend to get overlooked. So here's one of the smaller ones. This critter down here is a parasitoid wasp. And it does what all parasitoid wasps do, which is it lays its eggs in the eggs or larvae or pupae of other insects or sometimes other invertebrates like spiders. And then they develop inside that insect or that other invertebrate, eventually killing it. So they kind of blur the boundary between parasites and predators. This particular species here makes its living by laying its eggs in the eggs of cabbage white butterflies, which is why it's so small. So here it is for comparison with the eye of a cabbage white butterfly here. So you can see this is not a very large insect and actually gets around by hitching a lift on cabbage white butterflies. So this is a guy who's very much on your side. And in fact, parasitoid wasps are one of the main pest control operations in your garden. Mostly you don't notice them, but if they weren't there, you would soon notice, because you'd have a lot more aphids, a lot more caterpillars, and a lot more other herbivorous insects. So I'm going to kind of come back at various points during the talk to a series of kind of what I call big questions about wildlife gardening. And my first big question is the big question: are gardens good for wildlife? And the answer is yes, they are. Jennifer Owen showed, because her garden was not very exceptional at all, that her garden was absolutely packed with wildlife. And the only reason people ever thought that gardens were not good for wildlife was that nobody had ever looked. Once they did start to look, they found that there was indeed a huge amount of wildlife in gardens. Jennifer Owen's work also, I think, answers another big question about wildlife gardening, which is, does my garden have to be a mess? Does my garden have to be a jungle or a wilderness if it's going to support lots of wildlife? And again, the answer to that question is definitely no, because I mean, you may this garden here, it may well be very good for wildlife, in fact, and if you want to have a garden like this, don't let me stop you. But your garden doesn't have to look like this to be good for wildlife. A perfectly ordinary, acceptable, aesthetically pleasing, typical garden is still very good for wildlife. We know that because here's Jennifer Owen's, well, not exactly her garden, but her house. It's a perfectly ordinary suburban house in the suburbs of Leicester. Just a nice, tidy, ordinary garden. Nothing exceptional about it at all. Certainly not a mess. Here's another question, which I think is an important one and worries a lot of people who want to garden for wildlife. And that is, do I have to replicate, do I have to try to reproduce a wild, in inverted commas, habitat in my garden? And the wild habitat that a lot of gardeners strive to reproduce in their garden is a classic hay meadow, like this one here. This one pictured here is what you might call a real hay meadow in the Yorkshire Dales. In other words, a meadow whose only purpose is actually to provide hay for livestock. And do you have to, I mean, clearly these are very beautiful, but do you have to try and create things like this in your garden in order to please wildlife? And the answer basically is no, you don't. It can be a real struggle to reproduce these kinds of wild habitats in a garden context for a whole variety of reasons. The soil is usually too fertile. The scale is wrong, and all kinds of things make it really very difficult. But you don't need to. Let's just look back for a moment at Jennifer Owen's garden. This is a chunk of Jennifer Owen's rear garden, and you can see it looks very, very ordinary. Has all the things you'd expect in a typical suburban garden: flower beds, hedge, lawn. Elsewhere, there's a little pond, veg plot, a few trees, 1 or 2 fruit trees. Nothing very exciting at all. Certainly, Jennifer Owen made no effort to produce any of these classic bits of what I call fake countryside in her garden. No wildlife meadow, nothing like that. And yet she still had this amazing diversity of wildlife, especially invertebrates, in her garden. Here's another example. This gardeners. This will probably need no introduction to most of you in the audience. This is Great Dixter, and those of you who follow the sort of wildlife gardening developments probably know that Fergus Garrett, the head gardener now at Great Dixter, Christopher Lloyd's old garden, of course, before he died, carried out a few years ago a major biodiversity audit of Great Dixter, just to find out what was living in his garden. And what he discovered was that Great Dixter was just like Jennifer Owen's garden, in fact, better than Jennifer Owen's garden. Absolutely fabulous for any kind of wildlife you care to imagine. I mean, 400 species of moths, for example, is one number that I always remember. And although the whole of the garden was brilliant for wildlife, and although Great Dixter does have a wildlife meadow, what the biodiversity audit showed was that the best bit of the garden, the very best bit, the bit with the highest amount of biodiversity per square foot, was this classic long border here. In other words, an entirely artificial habitat made up almost exclusively of alien plants. This was the habitat that had the highest biodiversity at Great Dixter. So no, the biodiversity in gardens is there not because people are trying to do something different. It's there because of the gardening. That's why it's there. Still, looking at Great Dixter is all very well. Looking at Jennifer Owen's garden is all very well. But these are very small numbers of gardens. These are just individual examples. So this is kind of an anecdotal kind of thing so far. So this is where we get to the Sheffield BUGS project. This is because what we wanted to do in Sheffield was to look at a much larger number of gardens, to do an actual comparative study of a large number of gardens, to find out if they were all good for wildlife, and if they weren't all quite as good as Jennifer Owen's garden or as Great Dixter, why they weren't quite so good, and what were the really best gardens for wildlife and why. Now, this project produced a huge number of scientific papers, none of which I recommend anyone should waste their time reading. Now, if you want to know what we found, I turned the results into this little book, No Nettles Required, which is still available if you want to read it. We looked at 61 gardens in Sheffield, and these are just 9 of them, chosen more or less at random. But I think what they illustrate is that we tried to get as much of the variety as we possibly could of different gardens. Some of the gardens were very small, like this, just behind a sort of 2 up, 2 down terrace. Some were very ordinary, like this, with sort of pets and things in them. Some were clearly very old and established with lots of big trees. Some were very new. This one was very new, brand new, in fact, just a house, a new build house. So we tried to get a wide variety of different garden characteristics, and we did a detailed study of the wildlife. I say detailed as far as we could in the course of a 3-year research project. Nothing like as detailed, of course, as Jennifer Owen was able to do over her 30 years. Not only was time limited, there's a limit to what you can do in other people's gardens, but we did the best we could. And so we can answer from the BUGS results, Sheffield BUGS results, we can answer another of wildlife gardening's big questions, which is, do I need a big garden? Because many people assume that wildlife gardening only works, or at least works best, if you have a big garden. And we were careful in our Sheffield study to include gardens of a wide range of sizes, from really tiny up to really quite large. And we were able to show very conclusively that there was no effect at all of garden size. So you certainly don't need a big garden. You certainly don't need a garden this size. This is the Duke of Westminster's garden. Actually, it's just one corner of the Duke of Westminster's garden. His garden's much bigger than this. You don't need a garden that big. You don't need a garden of any size at all. In fact, garden size is completely irrelevant. Do I have to buy a lot of fancy gadgets? And when I buy fancy gadgets, I mainly mean boxes of various sorts. Now, of course, some things some kind of boxes you can buy, like bird boxes or bird feeders, are proven to work and certainly can be recommended. But in the last decade or two, it's become very fashionable to sell boxes for invertebrates. To an extent, actually, one starts to get the impression that the insects and other invertebrates that live in gardens had nowhere to live before we started buying them boxes to live in. So these are just 3 different designs. I honestly can't remember any what these are supposed to attract, because this is a study I was involved in Sheffield, which tried all these things and found that none of them attracted anything at all. Actually, they were all a complete waste of time and money. In the Sheffield BUGS project, we focused particularly on boxes for bees, because these are often highly recommended. And this box here, if you're wondering what it is a box designed to attract bumblebees. And most bumblebees nest in holes in the ground. So if you make a box like this with a nice inviting hole in it and position it in the right sort of place, in a bank or somewhere like that or whatever, not like this, just out in the open. This is just for photographic purposes. You could perhaps expect them to work. In fact, these are homemade because although you can buy them, they're really too expensive, and the project budget didn't run to buying them. So we made lots of our own, and we put them in suitable places in lots of different gardens. And I can report that they were a complete failure, and none of them worked at all. In fact, we were so amazed at how badly they worked that we went back and tried again, because a lot of these real holes that are used by bumblebees, holes in the ground, are old rodent nests, mice or vole nests. So we actually went back. We went back and we got a load of used mouse bedding from a pet shop and put used mouse bedding in these boxes, and then put them back in the gardens to try and make them smell of mice and maybe persuade bees that was a good place to nest. And that was a complete failure too. They didn't work. So we can say with a completely clear conscience that these are a complete waste of time. You can of course buy them, but we didn't in the BUGS project because they're expensive and we couldn't buy enough. I'm involved in another trial using real commercially available bumblebee nest boxes, and none of those worked either. So they get the complete thumbs down. However, a big success was nests for solitary bees. Most of our species of bees in Britain and in the world, in fact, are solitary bees. That is, they don't make nests, just single individual female bees lay their eggs with a bit of pollen, bit of nectar for food in a hole, some kind of hole. And if you provide a hole like this or like this, you can expect bees to use them. And this is a commercially available variety that we used. And this is one that we used in the Sheffield BUGS project, which is homemade, just made by drilling lots of holes in bits of wood. This one's made out of sawn off bamboo canes, as you can see. They worked, both of them. What I would say, however, is that I strongly recommend this design rather than this one, because this one has a variety of sizes of holes, and solitary bees come in a wide variety of sizes, from really tiny insects up to about the same size as honeybees. And the different size bees like to lay their eggs in different size holes, not surprisingly. So by giving the bees in your garden a wide range of sizes of holes to choose from, you attract the largest number of customers. The trouble with this arrangement here is, with the sawn off bamboo canes, is that all the holes are quite large and rather similar, and therefore you tend to exclude species that need smaller holes. Plus, these are quite expensive. This, as long as you have a few bits of timber lying around, is completely free. When they've been used, the holes have been used, the female bees block them up, block the entrance up, so you can see when they've been used. And the bees, the young bees, the larvae eat the stored food in there and then pupate over the winter and then emerge in the following spring. When they emerge, you leave a little hole like that you can see they've emerged. They're quite fun, actually. Two things to bear in mind with these things, if you make your own and use them, is that they should be somewhere sunny. Sunnier the better. Solitary bees love to nest in warm, sunny places, and ideally under some kind of shelter like this. So this is under the eave of a roof on a woodshed, and that keeps the rain off. And if you can keep the nest reasonably dry over the winter, that's better for the bees in there. If the nest gets soaked throughout the winter, they can suffer from fungal infection and sometimes die. So sunny, warm, sheltered, dry, ideally. Just bear in mind that almost any hole might be used by bees in your garden. They're quite adaptable creatures. This is just in my garden. In fact, I took this picture just the other day. A hole in the casing round a hose reel. There's a solitary bee nesting in there. Let me just say, however, that the majority of our solitary bees nest not in holes in wood or in walls, but in the ground. And these are not as common in gardens because they tend to prefer a nice, open, sunny, sandy, preferably sandy soil. And that kind of thing is not really very easy to provide in gardens. It's not very common. All I would say is, if you see something that appears like this in a scruffy bit of your lawn, at least you know to leave it alone, because there's a solitary bee nesting in there. That's in the, in fact, in this one, it's a bee called Andrena fulva, the tawny mining bee, which is one of the commoner ones that you find in gardens. Now, the big question, do I need to grow nettles? Why am I focusing on nettles? Every wildlife gardening book that's ever been written, nearly every article on wildlife gardening in a gardening magazine, nearly every wildlife gardening website will recommend at some point that you grow nettles. Why do they want you to grow nettles? Because nettles are the larval food plant of 2 or 3 species of common, attractive garden butterflies, small tortoiseshell, comma, red admiral, and so on. That's why they're asking you to grow nettles. Really, don't grow nettles in your garden. There's no point, and there's 2 reasons why you don't need to bother. One is that it doesn't work. The world has enough nettles without you growing any more. And secondly, I think this is getting 2 or 3 species of common butterflies completely out of proportion, because there are There are 50-odd other species of butterflies in Britain, which tend to get less attention because they're just less visually attractive. And in any case, Britain may have 59 or 60 species of butterflies, but Britain has 900 species of solitary moths, so of large moths. And so why not give a little bit of thought to what they like to eat? And in fact, that's nearly everything, frankly, because there are so many of them that they eat. Nearly anything you grow in the garden will be a food plant for something, for some moth or other. So don't get hung up on nettles. Really is a waste of time and doesn't work anyway. We tried nettles in the bugs project, nothing useful. And Jennifer Owen had nettles in her garden just by accident, and none of these butterflies ever nested in her nettles either. Now, the really big question, or one of the really big questions, must I grow only native plants? Do I have to grow native plants to keep native insects happy? Seems like a no-brainer, and lots of people actually regard wildlife gardening as kind of more or less synonymous with growing native plants. The Sheffield BUGS project didn't suggest that there was any very important role for native plants in gardens, but wasn't really designed to answer that question. So full marks to the RHS for setting up this experiment, which created lots of little sort of experimental plots, or what you might call little gardens, with 3 different collections of plants in them. And these plants were natives, that is genuine British native plants, near natives, that is Northern Hemisphere plants that were related to the natives, and then exotics, which are plants, completely unrelated plants from the Southern Hemisphere. So we're getting kind of further away from nativeness along here. Native at this end, emphatically not native at this end. So 3 lots of plots. And the previous picture was when it was newly set up. Later on, when it grew up, began to look more interesting, lots more vegetation, and so on. Lots of work involved here in collecting and identifying the insects by various means, using a suction thing here called a vortis sampler. Lots of other things were done too. This is all set up at Wisley, the RHS's garden in Surrey. Produced lots of interesting scientific papers, as usual, none of which I recommend you read, because the message is basically here. Across the whole study, natives supported more wildlife than near natives, which in turn were better than exotics. So if you think growing natives is a good idea, that's good news. But, and it's a very big but, the effect of plant origin was not large. Effect of plant origin was rather small and completely dwarfed by the effect of plant quantity. The more plants, the more flowers, the more wildlife, which is what the BUGS project found as well. To some extent, different plant types were complementary. So the exotics provide more late summer flowers than natives, and they also are more often evergreen, so they provide more shelter in the winter. So basically, what this says is the best thing is not to plant just natives or just exotics, but actually to grow both. And that's what most gardeners do, in fact, without even thinking about it. And finally, a huge part of the biodiversity in these RHS plots were detritivores. That is, the enormous number of animals that eat dead plants. So these are plants that live in and on the soil surface, beetles, millipedes, slugs, woodlice, you name it, which in turn support an enormous food chain of other animals. And they, the research showed, don't care at all about plant origin, which of course is exactly what you would expect, because once a plant's dead, the animals that eat it don't really care where it came from when it was alive. So no need to grow native plants, unless you like them. There are lots of nice native plants. My final big question, what's the best thing I can do for wildlife? The single best thing? Many would say, have a pond. Certainly very good, I would agree with that, but not my personal pick. The clue to my personal pick is 4 of our Sheffield BUGS gardens here, which were not the best for garden wildlife. And if you look at them, maybe you can see why. If a garden looks a bit dull, a bit flat, a bit two-dimensional, a bit empty to you, it looks that way to wildlife too. Here's one of the gardens in the survey that scored much better, had a lot more wildlife in it. And basically you could see why. Because all this stuff, all these trees, all these shrubs, all these big plants here, hedges, these are all habitat for wildlife and they're food for wildlife. The base of the food chain in the garden is insects and other invertebrates that eat plants. So the more plants you have for them to eat, the more places you have for them to live, the more of them there will be, and the more of all the other wildlife that eats them and eats them on the food chain there will be. So that's my advice. If you've got any choice in the matter, have a hedge rather than a fence. If you've got room to plant a tree, plant a tree. If you've got room to plant 2 trees, plant 2 trees. If you've got a tiny garden, plant a tiny tree. Basically grow as much and as big vegetation as you can in your garden. And that's the way to attract the most wildlife. And that's what all the research on wildlife gardening points towards. So there you go. That's it, folks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. And that was really interesting. And I like the way you were challenging some of the kind of widely held beliefs about wildlife gardening. So there's definitely some food for thought there. I've seen this, the chat's been quite busy and a few things have come through. Certainly there's quite a few people defending nettles. Interested. I think also for human kind of use as well as for animal use. But if we go, what we'll do now is we'll go over to the chat, and David, if you want to just pick up a few questions, we'll get started and then see what comes from there.
Yeah, will do. Okay. So as is usually the way with talks, you anticipate some of the questions and answered them already, but we'll have a look. So there's a question Catriona asked about high fences and fences sealing off gardens make a difference to anything for wildlife.
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, a fence, I always think a fence is an opportunity missed in a sense, because a fence is inert. I mean, if you're lucky, a few spiders might hang their webs from it or whatever, but basically a fence is inert. It's kind of dead. It's not doing anything. If you're starting out from scratch with a garden and you have any choice in the matter, you should always choose a hedge over a fence, because a hedge is living, it's habitat, it's food, it's a highway, it's porous. So fences, if you've any choice, I wouldn't go for a fence. If you have a fence, it won't particularly obstruct most of the wildlife getting from your garden to next door. The thing it will stop, of course, that it's got a hole in, is hedgehogs. Everyone has a fence should go out immediately now. I don't care if it's raining, and bash a hole in the bottom of it if you haven't got one already, because single-handedly that will massively improve the life chances of your local hedgehogs. But it won't much affect other wildlife, because flying wildlife, flying wildlife will fly over a fence, and most of the wildlife that's not flying in your garden spends all its time in your garden anyway, and therefore isn't really interested in trying to get into someone else's garden, if you see what I mean. But nevertheless, basically, fence is bad, hedge is good.
Excellent. Another myth-busting one. Howard asks, is Buddleia recommended or not?
Yeah, Buddleia's great. Buddleia's a terrific plant. Gets a lot of stick for escaping into the wild and then growing all over the place. And that, can be a problem sometimes in sensitive habitats. But honestly, in the garden, Buddleia is great. Buddleia is, for butterflies, it's not called butterfly bush for nothing. What butterflies really love, because butterflies are basically a bit idle, they don't like flying around too much to have to find something to eat. So a plant that has lots of nice, deep, nectar-filled flowers all in the same place. So the butterfly can just wander from one to another without making too much effort and access a lot of nectar, which is protected from all the other pollinators with shallower mouth parts. It's just butterfly heaven, basically. So Buddleia is certainly terrific for butterflies. I wouldn't discourage anyone from growing Buddleia.
Excellent. There was a bundle of questions around the solitary bee boxes and how you make them. In particular, how deep do you drill the holes? Do you drill the holes all the way through?
No. The holes should be blind with a single opening, and basically the depth is not critical. Essentially, if you find a drill it as deep as the drill, as long as that doesn't go out the other end, and that'll do. It's not critical, but a blind hole, certainly.
Okay. And somebody Joanna also asked about bee bricks for bees. Are they a good thing to do? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, a lot of bees don't. I mean, I showed you the bee that's nesting in the case of my hose reel, just to demonstrate that a lot of bees are just happy to nest in any old hole, frankly. So a lot of bees make no distinction between holes in wood, in stems, in a thatch roof, for example. They're often full of solitary bee nests, or holes in walls. And so if you put a bee block in a wall, or even in a house when it's being built, that's just another hole, and lots of bees will use those holes. Just make sure it's in the right place, sunny, sheltered, the usual instruction. But yeah, good idea. But you don't need them. And what I love about the bog standard wooden version that you just drill holes in is everyone's got a few bits of spare timber lying around in the shed or something, is that as long as you've got a drill, they're completely free. Whereas at least a bee block does have to be purchased.
Okay, thanks. I was question about whether any of the gardens in your study used chemical controls, pesticides and herbicides and so on. And a related question about if you do need to treat things like fungal issues in plants, are there things you would recommend that are not going to do too much damage to the rest of the biodiversity?
The Bugs project, we gave our garden owners a questionnaire to fill in to try and get a handle on what they were doing in their gardens. It asked them a lot of questions, not just about pesticides, but about how tidy they were, how often they mowed the lawn and stuff like that. And unfortunately, the answers to the questions about pesticides were not very helpful. And in the end, not really good enough to be analyzable. So one of the big open questions about gardening for wildlife remains whether modest targeted use of pesticides is actually all that bad for garden wildlife. In other words, if you just have, one of the less deadly sprays in your shed, which you bring out just when the numbers of aphids on some particular plant get just beyond a joke, but you don't use it otherwise. Whether that actually has any really big negative effect on garden wildlife overall is one of the big unanswered questions about wildlife gardening, I have to say. And I constantly wish we could do some research to answer that question. What I would say is the one thing that we did manage to get out of our garden owners, because it's such a simple yes or no question, was, do you use slug pellets? Some of them did, some of them didn't. And we found that slug pellets definitely seem to reduce the numbers of snails. We got fewer snails in gardens where the gardeners use slug pellets, but not fewer slugs. So there you go. Make of that what you will.
Excellent.
David, I see the chat's really busy, so we probably won't get through all of the questions. If anybody would like to ask a question in person, that we might have just time for one or two, but I'll leave you to it, because it's been really busy since you finished talking, Ken. So if you carry on, but there is an opportunity for someone to ask a question.
Yeah, I'll jump to a couple here, and then you've got someone coming in. So Marta and Roger asked related questions. Marta asked whether you'd be able to compare the wildlife in the gardens to the wildlife in the parks and countryside and surrounding area. And Roger asked whether the location of the garden and how it relates to the wider countryside has a difference on the biodiversity there.
The second question first, because it's got a simpler answer, or at least it's got an answer to which the Sheffield BUGS project gave a definite answer, because we had gardens in Sheffield, those 61 gardens, as well as being chosen for being different sizes and different ages and all the rest, they were different locations within the city. So some were right in the middle in concentrations of terraced houses and so on. And others were really near the edge of the city, near open countryside. And again, that had no effect at all on the wildlife we found in the gardens. Had no effect. I would say, however, we were concentrating on invertebrates, and I suspect if we'd looked at birds, we probably would have found that suburban gardens had birds that were coming in from surrounding countryside. So basically, a kind of overspill of non-urban birds. But as far as invertebrates are concerned, doesn't matter at all. And I've forgotten the other question now.
It was whether you'd be able to compare what you're finding in the gardens to the neighbouring area. Were they better? Were they better or worse?
It absolutely depends what the surrounding countryside consists of. If it's bog standard lowland intensive farming, which it often is these days, gardens are incomparably better. Gardens are much better than intensively farmed countryside. And in fact, there's a whole massive quantity of research now that shows that in the countryside, when people look at bumblebees and bumblebee nests and how well bumblebee nests survive and how many reproductive female queens and drones they produce and all the rest, there's a big effect of proximity to gardens. The nearer bumblebee nests in the countryside are to gardens, the better they do. The more remote from gardens they are, the worse they do. And that's because the countryside just doesn't have any flowers in it these days.
Thank you, Ken. I'm going to go to Fides now who's actually from Sheffield. So you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Yeah, done that. Hi, Ken.
Hi.
I wanted to ask about neem oil. I've been battling with whitefly and also aphids. And rather than brushing them all off, we've got a tiny garden. We live in a terrace, one of the old houses in Sheffield, and terraced with a tiny little terrace with a garden that's on a steep hillside and is mostly rocky. And yeah, I've been experimenting with neem oil, but with reluctance because I'm not sure what the effect on wildlife is.
No, and I'm not an expert either on particular chemicals.
Okay.
All
I just
would
found
say
that
about,
that was recommended because it's a sort of more natural kind of thing rather than.
All I would say is, that, I mean, nicotine's natural.
Yeah.
I would say naturalness is not a guarantee of harmlessness.
No.
All I would say is that when it comes to chemicals in the garden, always appreciate that whatever you use, even if you use something that people will tell you is completely innocuous, like garlic spray or soap or anything like that, if it kills aphids, it will kill aphid predators. And it will probably kill aphid predators even more effectively than it kills aphids. So here's the problem. Here's the problem. And I have this every year. I have this every year. Every spring, some of the plants in my garden are overwhelmed by aphids. And the temptation to wade in there and start killing the little beggars is almost irresistible. But when I look closely, if I really take the trouble to look closely, there's always ladybird larvae, there's always hoverfly larvae, there's always other predatory larvae, lacewings, already there. Now, takes them a while to catch up with the aphids. The aphids reproduce faster than they do. But in the end, if you can just be patient, what I always find is, and I've learned this through long experience now, is that the predators do eventually catch up with the aphids and they will sort the problem out for you. And anything you do that kills the aphids will kill the predators, sadly. Anything at all. Soap, even just blasting them off with water or brushing them off.
The time lag sometimes then kills the plant. Before the time lag have got round.
The time lag may kill the plant, but honestly, if you've got a plant that's just killed by aphids, maybe it's a plant you shouldn't have been growing in the first place. Grow something else.
Thank you. That was a great question, and I think we'll finish off there.
Great
but
question.
That was a really kind of good. I think that's a good point to finish out. And the kind of thing about waiting and observing and not jumping in necessarily, I think that's kind of a really good message for gardeners and for people kind of wanting to improve the quality of their gardens. Thank you ever so much, Ken. That was really thought-provoking. We didn't get to everybody's questions. I don't know if it's possible for us to email you some of the outstanding questions, or we could email something around to people afterwards, if that's possible. But that's entirely, very busy. Please don't worry if that's not. But anyway, we'll have a think about it. We'll certainly keep the chat.
Have a look through the chat. If there are, if there are a few key things that keep coming up that people really want to know, I can do my best.
That's fantastic. Thank you ever so much for a very thought-provoking and very, really fascinating talk, and to know more about the Sheffield BUGS project, which is not a project I, kind of particularly knew about at all. So I really enjoyed that myself. Thank you ever so much also to everyone for coming to attend, and thank you to thanks. I can see some clapping going on there. That's great. And thanks also to the Ecology and Conservation Studies Society for working with us on this series. It's been really fantastic. Just to let everybody know, there's plenty of clapping going on there, Ken. That's great. Just to let people know, our next LNHS talk will be on Thursday, the 19th of July, when Peter Warren will be talking about the wildlife of Copt Hall Gardens and the adjacent Epping Forest, which is a really fascinating site. Peter's been monitoring the wildlife of Copt Hall since 2012, and his talk is going to cover birds, mammals, fungi, dragonflies, and of course the trees. And so there's going to be something for everyone. I think it follows actually nicely on from today's talk, actually, because there's obviously part of that that is pretty much like a garden. So it'd be really interesting to find out what he has to say. Do sign up if you'd like to attend that. It is a popular talk, but we do have some spaces available at the moment. So, please do buy a ticket if you'd like, or don't buy, just sign up for a ticket. Please see our website for details of all our talks and sign up to our mailing list. There's a virtual talks mailing list which gives you first-hand information as soon as a new talk gets released. We hope to see you all again soon, and you can unmute yourselves if you'd like to say goodbye. Thank you once again to Ken for a really fascinating evening, and thank you to everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.